Welcome everyone to today's Edison Electric Institute webinar, a conversation on the ages of globalization with Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. My name is Vanessa Ferrero and I'm a manager for international programs at EEI. Today's session is part of our virtual conversation series, where we sit down with global experts and discuss the issues affecting our industry. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Sachs to speak about his latest book, The Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. Jeffrey is a world-renowned economics professor, best-selling author, innovative educator, and global leader in sustainable development. Currently, he serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He will be joined in conversation by Dr. Lawrence Jones, Vice President for International Programs at EEI. Throughout the session, please feel free to ask questions using the chat feature. Lawrence will aim to incorporate as many of them as possible into the conversation. Without further ado, I'll turn this over to Lawrence to kick things off.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone from around the world. Thanks and welcome to this another series of EEI's global virtual conversation. And as Vanessa said, today we're very delighted to have with us Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey, welcome to EEI.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you, Lawrence.
So, Jeffrey, we want to talk about the book, Ages of Globalization. But I think before we get into the book, I want to begin by asking you, how did you get into this field of sustainable development, and what was your journey like? Because obviously when I read about your background, you just didn't jump into this. What was some of the impetus that got you, or the drivers that got you into sustainable development over the years?
I think it was motivated by this big, wide, interconnected world that we have, trying to understand it and trying to help do something about it. From my earliest awareness of our world, and thanks to my parents, we were able to take some trips abroad while I was in high school already. I felt that I wanted to understand how the world's interconnected and why different parts of the world are so different. I had a pen pal in East Berlin at the height of the Cold War. And I went to visit my pen pal in 1972 and was completely perplexed by an iron curtain, as it existed at the time, between two halves of Europe, and went to study that situation and try to understand it in college. Went into economics as my response to that. But as I worked as an economist in many parts of the world, my professional career, I saw that what we called economics was only one pretty modest part of the puzzle, because different places were grappling with problems of geography, of climate, of disease, of isolation. And more and more, I thought, well, this is all really interconnected. We have an interconnected world. We have natural phenomena like climate or disease interconnected with society. We have the economy obviously interconnected with politics and with these natural forces. And it's been 40 years adventure now, but starting around 20 years ago, I felt that there was a new field taking shape. So when I moved from Harvard University to Columbia University in 2002, I asked Columbia to give me the title Professor of Sustainable Development. They said, well, we don't have that exactly. I said, well, could you manage it as my title, which they kindly did. And then I led the Earth Institute at Columbia for a number of years under the banner of sustainable development. And lo and behold, we created an undergraduate major in sustainable development, a PhD in sustainable development, and a faculty in sustainable development. And it became more and more of a discipline. And so it really was trying to create a systems vision to link multiple systems, the Earth's physical systems, the engineered systems, your department, and the economic and political systems, and our social dynamics, which have a lot to do with ethnicity, identity, religion, and so forth, and to understand that sustainable development involves, from an analytical point of view, a system of systems. And they each have their own dynamics, but they're each impinging on the others. And now we're trapped in many powerful currents where feedbacks from one system are impacting others. We have an emerging disease which has completely upended the economic system worldwide this year. So that is what led me to this field.
We'll come back to sustainable development. I think, given the work you've done with the United Nations, having advice to United Nations Secretary Generals, there's much we can discuss there, and we'll certainly come back to that towards the end of our conversation. But I want to come to the book, and you've chosen a very complex theme, globalization. And there's been much written about globalization. Some people say globalization is dead. Some people say the crisis of globalization. But you begin your book with a different take. And what I find fascinating, you begin by talking about the multiple ages of globalization. Basically, you identify 7 ages of globalization. So Jeffrey, from your standpoint, you also talk about the interplay between the 3 factors that you see driving globalization. You talk about the geography, you talk about technology, and you talk about institutions. We can't go through all 7 ages because that would take the entire hour. But if you could
everybody should read the book, you know.
Exactly. Go read the book to learn about all of them. But if you were to extract the key lessons from some of the major ages, and specifically I want to talk about the industrial age as it transitions into the digital age. Talk about these 3 factors: geography, technology, and institutions. How do they shape globalization, given where we are and where we've come from, at least going 1 age back?
Thanks a lot. You know, when I started my own profession, so to continue with that earlier biographical sketch, I got involved in developing countries in the 1980s, and they were opening their economies to trade. And I thought to myself, oh, this is globalization taking shape. So I thought this is a new thing. And then as I learned more, I realized, of course, there was a different kind of globalization in the 19th century, Imperial globalization, global scale politics and trade and finance under the British Empire, for example, so Pax Britannica. And I thought, oh, so globalization is really 200 years old. And then reflecting on it over the years and trying to understand the origins of the Industrial Revolution, it is clear that the real impetus of a worldwide society, economy, and politics began in the so-called voyages of discovery of Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And it was notable for me that Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, the founding text of modern economics, wrote that the 2 most important events in the history of mankind were the voyage to the Americas of Columbus and the voyage around the Cape of Good Hope from Europe to Asia of Vasco da Gama, because that created a global world. So I said, oh, okay, so globalization is 500 years old. And each time it became apparent, no, that's not really the right way to think about it, because the Mongol conquest created the greatest landmass empire in history in 1300, after all. The Roman Empire was trading with the Han China in 1 AD, after all. And so this story of long distance, geospatial interconnection is the story of humanity itself. And globalization has been a feature of us as Homo sapiens sapiens ever since the dispersion of anatomically modern humans out of Africa, from East Africa, across the Red Sea, into the Arabian Peninsula, across the Indian Ocean, back into Europe, but then by about 40,000 years ago, extending to all parts of the world already. We don't know exactly when the Americas were reached, but the dates keep getting pushed back from first 10,000, then 12,000, then 15,000. Now there's evidence of human settlements in South America 20,000 plus years ago. But in any event, humanity dispersed over a period from 70,000 years ago to roughly 10 to 15,000 years ago, reaching all parts of the world and remaining interconnected through long distance migration, even trade of precious stones or of tools and implements, which are often found hundreds of miles away from their geologic source. So it's a long story. What drives this story are the three things that I mentioned: institutions, which is about culture and politics, religion, language, group identity; geography, which affects where you grow food, where you can survive, where there's enough water for a crop, where the temperature range is adequate, where disease is not such an incredible burden that it makes animal husbandry impossible or even human survival impossible, and so forth. And fundamentally, technology, which I think is the single most important arrow of change over the long term, because learning how to do things and then incorporating them into human practice is probably the most fundamental way that society changes. Ideas change us fundamentally. Long-term climate changes us fundamentally, moving from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. But technological know-how is the long-term most important driver, and it accelerated in the last 300 years with the scientific revolutions of Copernicus and Galileo and Newton, the ideas of Francis Bacon of experimental knowledge, and then the inventions of the modern scientific age, the modern mathematical age, providing the framework and the tools for technological innovation, made the modern economy and modern society as we know it. And I date the sixth of these seven ages to James Watt, around 1776, multiply famous date, as our independence, as the publication of The Wealth of Nations, and as the date of the commercialization of James Watt's steam engine, as a transformative moment, because the steam engine was the most important technological breakthrough since agriculture. It allowed for the harnessing of fossil fuels and the breakthrough from what some historians call the organic economy, one that was limited by how much food you could grow, how much animal power you could maintain, how much human power you could deploy, to something that was orders of magnitude more energy, therefore more work, therefore more production, therefore more productivity, therefore more people. So the great changes started with the steam engine and mechanization with steam, and that gave us rail, ocean transport, massive global scale trade, industrial scale war, and of course it led to Menlo Park and to Edison, and to the age of electricity at the end of the 19th century, and then to the digital age, which I define as the seventh age, which is by some count about 75 years old. It dates to the mid 1930s, when the idea of a digital age entered the brain of Alan Turing, and his idea of universal computing machines. And from there to John von Neumann and modern computer architecture, and from there to the transistor, and then the integrated circuit, and then the microprocessor, and now the world that we live in today. And it's a deep transformation. And that's why I call it not just a continuation of the Industrial Revolution, but a new age.
So what you've done is great for me because you have gone through several of my questions in that historical context, which is great. So I want us to maybe then spend, some time then getting into the digital era where we are today. But before we do that, I just want to talk about industrialization for a second. You talk about Britain being the sort of the first industrialized country, and you gave reasons why. Obviously, coal, one of the reasons, and then you talk about the diffusion of industrialization. When you think of Africa and the developing countries, what pathways do you see for them with regards to industrialization? And I bring this up because energy is so central, and much of the developed world has industrialized based on fossil fuel. But the transition of the energy system means the question that comes to mind is, can a nation industrialize only on renewable energy, or do you need a mix, given the fact that you need to scale up energy to industrialize? Can you talk about that issue of industrialization and energy, and where do the developing countries go to industrialize?
Sure. Let me start by saying that in the 19th century, coal almost determined the path of global industrialization. Where there was coal, it was at least potential to industrialize. Where there was not coal, proximate, maybe in the neighboring country, but it had to be close, economically close. There could not be industrialization. And so you look at the arbitrary allocation of geologic deposits of coal, and it says a lot about the path of industrialization in the 19th century. Coal is largely in the northern temperate zones, only by geologic accident, because those zones were actually swampy tropics 100 million years ago, when the plant detritus got submerged in the swamp waters, and rather than decaying, was covered in sediment and eventually transformed into coal deposits. And with plate tectonics, those deposits ended up in a new location, mainly the mid-latitudes of the northern hemisphere. It's an accident, but if you look at the geology, the readily accessible coal was in England. That's why combining James Watt, his predecessor, Newcomen, and de Savory, who made the first steam engines in the late 17th century. Combine that with Isaac Newton, combine that with the great university, Glasgow, and the laboratories for Watt to work. You could see how the coal economy started. And of course, England had been using coal for centuries for dirty burning, for heat, not for power. It was the steam engine which made it for motive use. Then the Industrial Revolution spread more or less to where there were coal mines. And there were coal mines in the Asturias in Spain. There were coal mines in the Ruhr Valley in Germany. There were coal mines in Eastern Europe, in Silesia, and into Russia. And one watches the spread of industrialization over a century as each of those coal areas becomes an industrial zone. There was some coal in Australia and Japan, which allowed for early industrialization. But there was very little coal in tropical Africa, almost none. And indeed, one leader, Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, but the ruler of Egypt in the middle of the 19th century, wanted to industrialize with Egypt's cotton to have a textile industry in Egypt in the mid-19th century. I think very enlightened leader, but he couldn't make it work because Egypt didn't have any coal energy. It was importing, and it wasn't economical. It wasn't feasible to have a viable center. So the world divided up. The United States, lots of coal in the Appalachian region, became a big coal center, became the basis for heavy industry, for the steel industry in Pittsburgh and in the upper Appalachia. In the second half of the 19th century, it enabled the Midwest industrialization with Henry Ford in the beginning of the 20th century. But where you didn't have coal, you didn't have industry. Then, of course, with the invention of the internal combustion engine, came the importance of oil, and especially when Winston Churchill said that the British fleet should shift from coal to oil, the Middle East became significant for the first time. So geography mattered, but it mattered in a new way because the oil was useless except for some kerosene burning for lighting until the internal combustion engine. And then it was possible and quickly mobilized for mass use of oil for transport, principally, but also for power generation. That changed geopolitics. Again, most of the deposits came in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, and then in the Arabian Peninsula. And the empires, of course, chased that down and took over that oil, as power structures do. Again, Africa was basically left out of most of that, except Africa was colonized for its minerals, and imperial conquest throughout almost the entire continent came once the problem of malaria was at least controlled through quinine in British manufacturing of gin and tonics, let's say, for malaria control. Then Africa was overrun, but not industrialized. So a lot of where the fossil fuels exist determined the paths of industrialization. So what about today? I think that industrial development depends on ample energy, but ample energy can now come in multiple ways. Of course, it can come in hydro. That was already true by the late 19th century. It can come now with wind, solar, in large scale. Chile's mining sector is shifting from imported hydrocarbons to Atacama Desert sunshine. And so one of the biggest mining sectors in the world will essentially run on renewable energy shortly because of the mass transformation that's underway in Chile. Now, Africa is relatively bereft of coal, of course, except in the southern Africa and very Spartan deposits elsewhere. But it is amply endowed with sunshine, the best in the world, and with a lot of hydropower in projects like the Congo River Basin, the famed Inga Falls concept for 60 to 100 gigawatts of power. There's lots of power potential in East Africa through hydro and geothermal. So now the possibilities for industrialization on the basis of the new low-cost renewable energies are very real. And the poorest part of the world, the Sahel, which has been bereft of coal and hydrocarbons, but is all sunshine, has a real opportunity for mass power generation and for industrialization. There's one catch, though, now that is important, which is that industry doesn't provide the kinds of jobs that were true for earlier industrializers, mass employment, because we've not only moved to renewable energy, but we've moved to automated manufacturing. And so the number of jobs in industry is much less per unit of production. In other words, productivity has soared, labor productivity, because of the digital age as well. So all of this means that Africa can and should industrialize, but it also should recognize that the new jobs are going to come mainly in services rather than in the manufacturing. The manufacturing will be capital intensive, still very valuable, necessary for development, but not the huge job creating sector that it was for China in the 1980s and 90s, or for earlier industrializers in history.
And I think you make a very good point, Jeffrey, with regards to the industrialization, the need for scaling of renewables. And I think one thing I've been hearing is the need for Africa to start thinking about improving or developing the manufacturing sector around renewables, so that they actually are manufacturing solar panels and solar technology in Africa to sort of break any kind of a dependency. So that's a very interesting point. So we've gotten a couple of questions coming in here around a topic that I know everyone is eager to hear about. And the book came out just when COVID hit. And so a lot of questions around the issue of what are potential impacts of the pandemic. We've had pandemics before, but what makes this one different? And how is this one going to affect globalization going forward? What are your thoughts on that?
So pandemics are part of globalization. They're caused by globalization, and they change globalization. And famous pandemics in history that hit Athens in the middle of the Peloponnesian Wars, or that hit the Roman Empire in the second half of the 2nd century, and then again in the 6th century AD, played a big role in history. The Black Death, of course, in 1347 to 1351, reshaped Europe, and actually was perhaps a causal precursor of the Renaissance itself. So pandemics play a very big role. What's notable in this pandemic is how fast it traveled, first of all, because in earlier pandemics, the spread was over the course of years. It's estimated, though nobody knows for sure, it's assumed by most historians that the Black Death is Yersinia pestis bacterium that originated in that period in Central Asia, most likely, Western China. And one guess by a famous historian is that it moved from China to Italy over the course of 16 years, over land and then by ship. So from 1331 in Western China, around Xi'an, to reach the ports of Italy in 1347. This time it wasn't 16 years, this time it was 16 hours. Probably, though nobody's absolutely sure, from Wuhan, China to Italy by direct flight, Alitalia, carrying the virus. So the virus hopped on the plane, went everywhere, infected the whole world, seeded epidemics. So the first point is, of course, that this is a part of globalization itself. Probably the three big reshaping events that we should consider are whether the pandemic will somehow deeply change trade policy to localize production rather than to depend on long distance supply chains. So the idea is that we will deliberately choose localization over globalization. That's question number one. Question number two is whether this move to the digital world that has been dramatically accelerated by COVID, by McKinsey's estimates, the rate of acceleration has been 25-fold. digitalization in 2020 compared to the pace that was occurring, but slowly up to 2020. And the third is whether this will change geopolitics in a way that will upend globalization, because one way that globalization has been stopped in the past temporarily is through global geopolitics, conflict, or cold wars, or dividing the world. So it's claimed on many fronts that globalization will have the effect of localizing supply chains, mainly along the lines of the first and the third ideas that, well, now we can't trust the outside world, so we'll have to do it on our own. On the other hand, the digital is very interesting, because the acceleration to digital, on the one, it does mean a change of economic geography again. It may mean you don't have to live where you work, or you work in cyberspace, so you don't work in any physical location, least of all an office. That's how we're living right now. This will become not absolutely a virtual work environment, but at least a blended work environment in the future. It will definitely change the geography of cities, of office buildings, of commuting, and so forth. Will it change the global dynamics? I doubt it, in that the digital world is ideal for global. I'm on global conferences every day, many of them every day. So I'm with my foreign colleagues far more frequently than I was, and I was traveling relentlessly, but now I'm traveling nonstop, virtually every day, maybe 5 to 10 meetings overseas every day. So it means less travel. Definitely being an airline owner would not be a comfortable thing right now. Being a tourist operator is definitely a hardship business right now. But the global interconnectedness is probably increased, not decreased. And second, the jobs will be more global in this way. Now you can have an employee hired anywhere, and I'm doing that. I'm sure we're all doing that. When workers tell me, people tell me, well, I live in such and such part of Europe. Okay, doesn't matter. We don't have an office. We have meetings. So as long as the time zone can work for you, we can work together. So I think that a lot of jobs of the past were, in development, for example, were labor intensive operations, making shoes or making garments. But now the jobs will be sitting at home in Accra or in Addis or in Delhi, working for an international company in an online activity. Why not? Because talent is everywhere. The boundaries are more broken down. So I think we're going to see more globalization of many, many activities. We're certainly going to see healthcare delivered globally, because your radiologist can be in any part of the world. Of course, when we need almost any kind of servicing right now of any kind of appliance, our service agent seems to me almost invariably in Uttar Pradesh or someplace halfway around the world, but that's going to be more and more the case, not less and less the case. So I think globalization is not in any way ended by this phenomenon. It's paced most fundamentally by technology and human desires. People will desire to travel more as soon as it's safe, but they will continue to interact, albeit virtually rather than in physical proximity for a while. But it does mean globalization's continuing and even being amplified in this new way.
So I think we will adapt to the new environment. I think based on what you're saying, there will be some adaptation from our behavior. The economy will have to adapt. Everything will have to adapt to the new normal, if you will, or whatever is going to be the new normal going forward. Staying on the issue of digital, you also in the book talk about the three challenges you see around the digital era. And I want to spend some time on that briefly before we come back to talk about sustainable development goals. We've got a lot of questions on sustainable development, but just talking about these three challenges: inequality, the issue of the planetary boundaries, and on that one, Jeffrey, your equation, the only equation in this book, by the way, for anyone who's interested, is an equation that I think warrants some discussion because it helps us to understand the kind of balancing act we have to do. So let's maybe talk about the issue of inequality around globalization, how we deal with that, and then the issue of planetary boundaries, specifically, what do we need to do to balance that equation that you put in the book? And we'll save the risk of conflicts for towards the end. But I want to just spend some time on the two now, the inequality issue and the issue of planetary boundary. What do we need to do to balance that equation?
Well, the inequality issue is, a pervasive, fascinating, and important issue. In that we have a remarkably unequal world. Partly development creates inequality because before economic development, that is before the Industrial Revolution, almost everybody was a poor farmer in the world. And so the gaps of income were very slight, except for a few aristocrats or monarchs. Basically, living standards were pretty meager and pretty close to subsistence for most of humanity. And a peasant life in one part of the world will look pretty familiar to a peasant life in another part of the world. But with economic development, we now span still subsistence on one end, and there are several 100 million people living in subsistence, to wealth that is unimaginable in the past. We have 500 people in the world today, 500, that have a net worth, last time I checked, which was last week, so I'm a week out of date, it had reached $7 trillion for 500 people, the richest 500. It had gone up more than $1 trillion since the start of the year. Of course, these are the people who own the online world that we're operating in. Mr. Bezos, Mr. Gates, Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Musk. The four of them together have a net worth of about $530 billion, just four people. So we have an extraordinary inequality, unprecedented in orders of magnitude gap between the richest and the poorest. And we have to ask, what does this technology mean for that? And it's absolutely a fascinating and complicated story, because on the one hand, this technology is so good and it's at such low marginal cost that if we use it creatively, everyone can get access to a myriad of services unimaginable in the past. We can all watch movies, read books, have access to thousands of journals and literature. We can be citizens online. We have our GPS and our maps and our streaming, telemedicine, online free educational services, e-commerce, and so on. Potentially, it's the near zero marginal cost, mass availability. Fiber carries so much data that basically almost the sky's the limit in terms of access to digital services. On the other hand, these digital services create natural monopolies, network monopolies, and they lead to absolutely unprecedented market power and unprecedented wealth. So I quoted the four leaders of wealth rankings in the United States. The increase of their wealth this year is beyond the levels of wealth imaginable in the recent past, what's increased for them this year. And of course, Facebook is now being sued everywhere for monopolization. We've had many reports about the concentration of the digital world. So when you look at this analytically, and then one more point, which is the digital definitely leads to the elimination of jobs through automation. There's just no doubt about it. And it doesn't automatically create an equal number of balancing jobs. That's not correct. It decreases the demand for labor of many kinds. It may increase the demand for certain kinds of skilled labor of other sorts, but it definitely shifts the labor demand schedule against work, and wages are going down for large parts of the population. All of this is to say that there are two faces of this digital age, a utopian and a dystopian face. The utopian face says plenty for everybody. The dystopian face says two people own everything and all the rest have no jobs because the digital world does all of that and we end up paying and don't have the chance to earn a living. You know what? Theoretically, both are possible, actually. This is the weird thing. They're not, one is not a naive view of the other. They're both possible outcomes. Market forces probably are more disequalizing than equalizing in the digital world, but political or shared investments in telemedicine, e-education, and so forth, and income redistribution could ensure universal access. So it's a long-winded answer to say, I think the future of inequality is mostly a political choice, not a guaranteed outcome. It's not true that markets will lift everybody by any means. Markets will impoverish vast parts of the population in the digital age. But in principle, this technology, which I think is so astoundingly good, could enrich everybody if we choose to deploy it in that way.
Let me ask you a question, Jeffrey, on the issue of the inequality and tying it back to the equation about the boundary, the planetary boundary. There's a question here that talks about the need for or the exploration of basic universal basic income. And
Yeah.
we've heard that there have been experiments in Finland, there's been experiments in Canada. What do you think about that notion of sort of a universal basic income? Any quick reflection on that? And then I want to come back and talk about sustainable development goals. But what do you think about this issue of universal basic income?
We already have an idea of universal basic economic rights that are part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We already agreed, although most people aren't aware of it, 72 years ago in the UN, that everybody has the right to healthcare, education, social protection, decent livelihoods. So those are already enshrined rights. So universal basic dignity, I would say, is the right approach. Universal basic income is one specific way to approach the problem. It says give everybody a certain amount of money per year. A different way to approach the problem is to say everybody gets healthcare, everybody gets education, those are socially provided. Everybody gets social support if they need it, but nobody is guaranteed the rest of the income if they're able-bodied and able to work. And so universal basic income is one mechanism that can ensure what I would call universal basic dignity, but it's not, it's controversial in one way because it says you don't have to work, you don't have to make your effort, it's just guaranteed for you. And I'm probably enough of a Puritan to say, if you can, you got to contribute. But for certain things, it's your right, no matter whether your contribution is highly remunerative or not. Your paycheck should not determine whether you can have health care or whether your children can get a good education or whether they can attend university. So my view is we should guarantee a certain part of consumption goods to ensure that everybody has the dignity of a decent life, even if they're not earning that much. But I don't think we should say, work is just an option because you're underwritten no matter what. I think that it probably would be demoralizing for society in a way to say you have no responsibilities, only rights. Now, of course, pushing poor people to commute 3 hours a day away from their children without health care, without child care, to try to survive on $10 an hour in poverty. That's what we do now in this country, in the United States, which I'm completely against that way of treating people. So when I say work, I don't mean it as a punitive requirement. I mean it as a requirement of social contribution, not as a punitive means that keep poor people poor.
And I think we need to have a bit of imagination or reimagination of where the world wants to go when it comes to these kinds of things, how you design society, how you deal with some of the issues like, and I like the idea of universal basic dignity. I'm going to use that one going forward because I think it's much broader and it kind of brings the level of accountability and responsibility on both the society, but also on the individual. Let's talk briefly, because I want to get at least 3 more areas before we end here, but let's just talk briefly about the place you've worked, the thing you've worked with for the last 30, 40 years, sustainable development. You wrote your book in 2006 about extreme poverty ending by 2025. Obviously, COVID has probably thrown things out of gear in terms of the direction. But where are we on the sustainable development goals? We have 17 goals. Can you just quickly tell the audience, from your perspective, what's going to be achievable by the year 2030 and what needs to be recalibrated going forward? What are your thoughts?
So sustainable development, first of all, means prosperity, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. And the 17 goals are all for that we end poverty and hunger, that we ensure universal access to basic services and basic needs, and that we do all of this with renewable energy and sustainable land use practices. That's what it adds up to. We were not on track even before COVID to meet the target of ending poverty by 2030 because we don't work very hard at it. We don't put the resources in, mobilize the investments, help the poor people, give them the extra training or infrastructure in order to accomplish what we have promised. But we could, because the world economy in a normal period, but even now is roughly $100 trillion economy. As I mentioned, 500 people have $7 trillion of wealth. There's no real reason for people to be living in extreme deprivation if we care to do something about it. So again, while the timing means that on a normal course of action, we won't achieve the goals that we have set. On a non-normal course of deep engagement, we could do fantastic things and make breakthroughs in a short period of time if we choose to do it. It's one of the painful parts of the kind of work that I do, which is basically listening to engineers or public health specialists say, well, yeah, Mr. Sachs, if we have enough resources, we could do this in 5 years. We could do this in 10 years. And my feeling is, as an economist, come on, that's not such a heavy burden. We could get every child in school in the next 10 years if we made it a priority. But strangely enough, we just don't make it a priority to accomplish these things. So I always hate to say we're not going to meet the goals or we can't meet the goals. It all is relative to what we choose to invest in, how much effort we choose to make. I think, as I've been saying, that digital is potentially the great leapfrog possibility. 20 years ago, when when I worked in sub-Saharan Africa, all over the continent, rural areas were isolated. People didn't have information. They were subsistence farmers. They didn't even go to market. Now everyone, and they didn't have electricity, they didn't have phones. It was, you spent a day or two to get to a rural area, and life was living in rural isolation. Isolation was the dominant feeling that I had. Completely different now. Everyone can be connected. Everyone can have solar energy and microgrids. Everyone can have wireless broadband access. Everyone can be working in a global scene, of course, with training and education. I'm not oversimplifying, but my point is there's no intrinsic barriers. It used to be there were no banks around. So how could people do banking? And 20 years ago, we said, oh, how are we going to get bank branches to rural areas? And so you don't need a bank branch anymore in this world. You don't need a bank anymore in this world. You don't need physical money anymore in this world. So we have the chance to do truly leapfrog things if we're organized to do it. And usually, yeah, okay, now I have to find $20 billion extra, or $50 billion for such and such, or $100 billion to get all kids in school. But then I think, wow, out of $100 trillion annual output, that's pretty small. Then you go to Congress and they say, well, we're not so interested. You go to rich people, I already gave. So we have a hard time taking seriously these issues, but not a hard time solving them at a technical level. And I think we need to combine our ethics, our sense of well-being, and our technological capacity all together to prioritize our kids, to prioritize the end of extreme deprivation, to achieve universal basic dignity. And then even 2030 is not, it's not too soon to really accomplish those breakthroughs.
So I want to wrap things up, Jeffrey, by talking about the last of the three, which is institutions. And specifically, let me give you a three-part question, and then you can tackle that as we wind up here. The first one has to do with the global collaboration that's necessary to achieve some of these big global, to tackle some of these big global challenges. And obviously, now with the incoming Biden administration emphasizing the U.S. re-engagement in the world, getting involved in climate, what are your views on what should be the approach for the U.S. re-engaging the world from the perspective of the incoming Biden administration? That's one. The second thing has to do with the United Nations and other global institutions. In your book, you talk about the need to sort of reform the UN and reform other institutions. What are the first 2 or 3 steps needs to be taken along this issue of reforming the UN? And then the last thing having to do with the Vatican. This week, the Vatican became part of the coalition on the inclusive capitalism. We've seen a movement around the industries around ESG as one of the drivers. What role do you see the private sector playing in terms of addressing some of these big issues we're facing? So first, incoming Biden administration, re-engagement with the world from a globalization perspective, reforming the UN, what needs to happen, and then lastly, the role of private sector and investors as seen through the eyes of ESG and even the role of the Vatican.
Excellent. They all come to the basic point that the gains to cooperation right now are huge. And the idea that we're living in a zero-sum struggle, that it's us versus China, that it's America first as the way to solve problems, is the big issue to overcome. I always like very much the line of one of my gurus, E.O. Wilson, the evolutionary biologist at Harvard, who says we've stumbled into the 21st century with our Stone Age emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technologies. And so he emphasizes that we're operating at 3 different timescales. The human nature is deeply ingrained, 50,000 years old. Our institutions are 200 years old. our technologies are changing by the moment. And this asynchronous nature of our lives is what makes things hard, because our ancient human nature says us versus them. We don't have the cognizance and awareness and identity of a universal humanity properly. So we find it hard to cooperate. We find it easy to mistrust. We find it easy to blame others. We have all sorts of confirmation biases. We have to overcome that through awareness, that the way we're looking at the others, they're looking at us this way, and it's not it means that we're not satisfactorily cooperating. I think that this is absolutely key. It got very bad in recent years because the U.S. pulled out of all these international agreements, out of treaties. Every time we had a treaty, the administration would say, well, if they want to be in the treaty, it must be that they're taking advantage of us. That kind of view that everything is zero sum. So we need, when Biden comes in, we need to get back into the UN. First, rejoin the World Health Organization. Second, rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Third, rejoin the UN Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. Fourth, rejoin international treaties, and so on. So this is point number one. The UN is in its 75th year this year, founded in 1945. It's vital for our future, vital for sustainable development. It operates on a shoestring, actually. It's viewed as, oh, this wasteful bureaucracy, but the core budget is tiny, a few $billion to run the world's multilateral system. So the most important thing for the UN, actually, is to be properly financed so that organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization and WHO and others can do their job properly, helping kids to be in school, overcoming food crises, of course, fighting the pandemic. That's, I think, the second. You mentioned the Vatican and ESG. ESG investing means environmental, social, and governance criteria for investment decisions. The point is we need values at the core of our economy. It's not just blind market forces that will do. It is markets harnessed by values and complemented by shared action. For instance, universal provision of health and education services. And so it's that package deal that is so incredibly important. And in that comes the private sector, which of course has the technologies, does so much of the innovation. Look at the development of the sector. We need that kind of public partnership around good or our social goals. Certain things can be left to profit motive and market competition, but other things need government, business, academia, and civil society working together to ensure that all our kids are in school, to stop the pandemic, to bring about the transformation of the energy system so that it's climate safe. Business has a huge role to play. It can't resist these forces. It can offer technology and business models for success, but it will be in partnership with the other sectors of society.
Well, Jeffrey, to wrap things up, let me just ask you in closing. The last sentence in your book reads, and I quote, "Our greatest hope is to use the lessons of history and of our common human nature to forge a new era of cooperation at the global scale." Are you confident that that hope can become a reality?
We're going into a good year in 2021, I can tell you, because we're going to have, I think, a renewed American commitment to the global common good. We're going to have some new vaccines coming along, thanks to the breakthroughs of science and to the work of the public and private sectors. And we're going to have several big diplomatic gatherings in 2021 that will make a difference. World Ocean Summit in Portugal in April, a biodiversity summit in China in May, a World Food System Summit at the UN in September, and the Climate Summit in Scotland in November. And these are all opportunities for the world to say, okay, we're not going to go on in this state of conflict or neglect or facing pandemics one after another. We're going to get our act together as humanity to do it together for the common good. So I'm looking forward to a good 2021.
Well, Jeffrey, let me congratulate you once again on the book, The Ages of Globalization. I've enjoyed reading it. Like I showed you the last time, I've marked it up in and out.
Thank you.
I didn't get through my 150 questions that I came up with, but I think it's a very good book for holiday reading, simply because it will put you at ease reading the book and understanding that the trajectory of globalization is one that will continue on as a globe, as a human species. And I think there's hope, as Jeffrey, you indicated, if we can find ways to collaborate, trust one another, and basically find a way to understand that we're in this together. We either sink together or we sail together and become successful. So with that, I'd like to thank you, Jeffrey. I wish you a happy end of 2020, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully in person in 2021.
I'm looking forward to that. And thanks to you for this discussion. I really enjoyed it. And to everybody that's participating, I'm most grateful.
Thank you so much. Vanessa, over to you.
Thanks, Lawrence. And thank you, Jeffrey, for all of your insights again. And thank you to everyone for joining today's conversation and asking so many thoughtful questions. We will be sending out a recording to all attendees, which we will also be sharing on our YouTube channel, where you can find recordings from other past virtual conversations and webinars. To continue engaging with EEI international programs and to learn about other upcoming events, please follow us on Twitter or visit our website. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.